Welcome to this conversation with John Scanlon. That is our celebration, year-long celebration that we started in May for the 50th anniversary of the United Nations Environment Program, the anchor institution for the global environment. My name is Maria Ivanova. I am the director of the Center for Governance and Sustainability at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, where I'm also a professor of global governance. And it is my distinct pleasure today to welcome John Scanlon for indeed our last dialogue for this year, for 2021. And next year, as we start in January, it will be the 50th anniversary of UNEP. So John is a longtime colleague and friend, someone that we have looked up to in various settings as he has led various institutions in the global environmental governance landscape. So today we will talk with John about his views as an insider in many of these institutions. And now he's a little bit on the outside. So we'll push some of those boundaries, see how much will John Scanlon tell us? Where can we go from here? So I welcome you all into this space. I'd like to introduce John first, give you some pointers on how we'll do this discussion, and we'll jump right in. So this is our fifth dialogue in the series of UNEP at 50, and I welcome John Scanlon. He was the Secretary General of the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, known by the acronym of CITES, from 2010 to 2018. And before that, he was a principal policy advisor at UNEP, where he led many of the high-level policy processes. Currently, John is the Chief Executive Officer for the Elephant Protection Initiative. He has a background in law and experience in both national and international organizations. National in Australia, where he is a national. And John offers a unique perspective on environment and sustainable development, and indeed on the past and future of UNEP that we celebrate. Welcome, John.
Thanks, Maria. Great to see you. Thank you for that very generous introduction.
Well, welcome here. And I look forward to our dialogue today. For those of you who have joined us previously, you know these are informal dialogues where we really rely on those of you in the Zoom room to engage. The chat is open. You can react, you can have thoughts and more general reactions. When you have specific questions that you would like to queue up, please put them in the Q&A function, and there's already one there. So are you going to send the recording to everyone? We will share, and we'll also put it on our social media. So I will integrate the questions as they come in to the best of my ability. We also have some questions that came in beforehand. So please engage in the chat on general issues, reactions. We have one of our doctoral students, Jadine, monitoring that function, and put any specific questions that you would like John to answer in the Q&A function. With that, I will begin. Our last dialogue, John, was with Marta Rojas, who was the Secretary General of a sister convention, the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands. And it's great to engage with the conventions in this space where you served as in that post as the highest post of a Secretary General. And as we speak from this high level platform today about your experience in the conventions and at UNEP, we will learn more about you. But before we do that, I'd like to ask, who is John Scanlon, the person? But specifically, what motivates you, John? What motivates you to do what you do?
Great, thanks, Maria. And firstly, congratulations to you, and thanks for putting on this series of dialogues in the lead up to the 50th anniversary. It's a great initiative, and thanks very much for inviting me to join you today. Who am I? How long have we got? No, as you know, I've worked across multiple continents and organizations and disciplines, but in terms of what drives me, there's a few things that drive me. I have a great love of nature or the environment, and I think that was instilled in me from a very young age, growing up in Australia, spending a lot of time in the bush, spending time with my Swedish grandparents who lived in rural Sweden. I have a great desire throughout my life to engage in the international system, to work internationally, and perhaps that's related to the fact I'm a first generation Australian. My parents took us overseas at a very young age. We went to Japan, the then Soviet Union, Sweden, the UK. We had relatives visiting us from Brazil, Canada, all over. And I think I was just, if you like, caught up in that whole international engagement. It always interested me. And thirdly, and this perhaps came a little later in life as I went from school to university, a great passion for the law, policy, and politics. And that's not party political politics, a small p politics. So I think from a very personal level, those three things have driven me. And I've tried to see in my career if I can have those three converge: the environment, international, and law, policy, and politics.
Thank you, John. And I know many of our guests today, the participants, these are also issues that drive them, and they have been converging them in their careers. We see many names that are familiar, and you'll see in the chat, people know you and they say, hello, John, I've worked with you in CITES. But before we go into to those issues, I'd like to take a step back, because this series is about UNEP, and we are celebrating the 50th anniversary. And you entered UNEP at the start of a period with a new executive director, Achim Steiner, who was our second interlocutor in this dialogue series in June, and who is now the administrator of UNDP, development program. So when you entered, what did you see as UNEP's strengths and its comparative advantage? And did that change over time? What is UNEP's comparative advantage now, as we're celebrating this 5 decades of operations?
Thanks, Maria. And yeah, I was actually recruited from Sydney. I was in Sydney at the time when we're recruited to UNEP to go to Nairobi. But I had interacted with UNEP before. So I was director of the IUCN Environmental Law Center in Bonn, Germany. And we were doing a lot of work on environmental law, obviously, but a lot of work in particular with the judiciary around the world. And UNEP was doing a lot of work in that space as well. So I had a lot of interaction, in particular with those involved with the law program of UNEP. So I had an introduction to UNEP before I was recruited, but I always had a great love for the UN. I have to say, I know the UN's imperfect and there's a lot of things that can be improved about it, but I was always taken with the UN. And the UN Environment Program, was the world's UN Environment Program. And I remember, when I was younger, I had this little, I don't know, it was like a pyramid that had UNEP on it with a little globe in the middle. And I used to love that. And this idea that you have a global program that's looking at the environment, for me, I was taken with it. So I was automatically attracted. In terms of, comparative advantage and weaknesses, I mean, the comparative advantage for me, and particularly coming from IUCN, was always that it was part of the UN. I mean, it was the UN's environment program. It had access to member states. It had, I think, what I think of is the credibility of the UN behind it. And it had a number of partners that wanted to engage. I don't think it always treated its partners as well as it could have, but there were people that wanted to gravitate towards the program. So it could bring states and others together. In terms of weaknesses, I found that my early interaction, this when I was with IUCN, they weren't always as generous to their partners as perhaps they could be. They wanted to be seen in the lead, and I can understand why. I wasn't convinced when I went to governing council meetings that they were always as responsive to member states as perhaps member states were hoping for. Sometimes there was an agenda going on and member states felt that they weren't being responded to the way they wanted to. And I'd say the other weakness was it seemed a little bit fractured in terms of the way the institution was functioning. It seemed a little bit siloed, but overall, I went with very positive impression, and I was very excited to get to Nairobi and join UNEP, and I loved it.
You mentioned the credibility of the United Nations as a strength and a foundation to build on. I'd like to ask you if that has changed now. We are in a different geopolitical setting right now. How is the credibility of the United Nations today, and why? And to this point, we did receive a question in advance from Pradeep Dey from India, who asked for your reflections on multilateralism in addressing environmental issues, which relates to the same issue of the credibility of the UN and what is the state of multilateralism today?
Yeah, I think when I look at the UN, I don't know whether it's just that I'm getting older and I've been around longer, and I had a more naive approach many years back that, you know, you look at it in a different light to when you've been around for a while and you've seen it and how it operates. I don't know if it's just the passage of time or things have actually changed. I think it's probably a mix of two. You know, the UN and multilateralism more generally is a little bit under pressure, a little bit under strain at the moment in many different ways. There's a lot of geopolitical tensions around in all manner of ways. The UN is a very old institution now. You know, it was created post World War II. It hasn't been able to keep up with and keep pace with change, and in many different ways, and there are many reasons for that we understand. But I think that's perhaps becoming a little bit more apparent now. It's quite fractured. It's not as nimble perhaps as it needs to be. Perhaps it's a little bit competitive within itself still, rather than looking out. It still competes a little bit too much internally. But overall, I think as much as people criticize the UN, I do think there's still that soft spot for the UN, and there's a sense that, you know, while we know it's not quite what we want it to be, we want it. And it's a very difficult institution to reform for many, many legitimate reasons. And some bits of it work better than others. And that's the reality. Some bits are working quite well, other bits not so well. So I still think it's a positive, but it is certainly facing challenges on multiple levels.
You mentioned reform. Indeed, every UN Secretary General has come in with the member states requiring reform of the UN. Kofi Annan was a prominent figure in that, who started the whole UN reform process. But since we're focusing on UNEP, you were there when the push for UNEP reform was front and center on government's agenda. As you were preparing for Rio +20, the 2012 conference on sustainable development, the reform of UNEP was #1 issue that you were working on while being in the leadership of UNEP. Take us to that time and tell us what were the main issues and what happened, and was UNEP reformed and how?
Okay. Well, you know, joining UNEP in 2007, when Akim started his first term, there are a number of issues there. And I think the parties were quite generous because they gave Akim the opportunity to reform. They invited him to do a medium-term strategy, which was a very useful vehicle to advance reform. But reform was pursued on many different levels. Firstly, the machine of UNEP, you know, the secretariat and how it was functioning. It was not functioning effectively enough. And when we joined, there were basically 6 UNEPs. There were 6 divisions. They operated as 6 different universes. And you could have said there were 6 UNEPs, you know, that they were just not interacting. There were all sorts of issues with other aspects of the administration. Akim set up a strategic implementation team. He asked me to lead. We had a great team. We had Janet Machari in charge of gender, Sheila Agarwal Khan with program, Patrick Tiefenbacher, results-based management, Jakob Dürr, human resources. We had a colleague who had ICT. I've just forgotten his name. Sorry about that, Robert. So we were, you know, pushing things on several levels internally, plus looking at the medium-term strategy in terms of, you know, what were the objectives of the organisation, what was it trying to achieve. Plus, through parties, we were running the IEG, the International Environmental Governance Reform, which I was also lead for the Secretariat there. Now, just let me pick a couple of those. How were you going to break down the silos of UNEP? You could not ask for coherence and sort of better cooperation within the UN when you couldn't have coherence or cooperation within your own organisation. So we needed to operate as one UNEP. And Patrick Tiefenbacher was the one that drove this idea of having a medium-term strategy where we had the priorities, but the priorities were not aligned to the divisions. The priorities were the priority issues, and the divisions were going to show how they're going to contribute to that, so that they had to work together. And it was a pretty blunt instrument. It wasn't perfect, but I tell you what, we needed it. We needed to crack open those silos. And okay, there was, you know, a bit of collateral damage along the way, but it was a necessary and a useful reform. And it still goes on today. So we put that first medium-term strategy in place. And in part, I mean, Agnes Kalabala, the ambassador from Tanzania, you know, she said in a very early meeting, you know, Akim, you know, it's great, but it's everywhere, but it's nowhere. So you've got to tell us, where are you going to be? Where are you going to make an impact? And that was the idea behind the medium-term strategy. On the whole IEG reform, that was party-led, that was state-led, I should say. And so I was working with states parties on that. Some states were very cautious about that to start with, because they know once something started, there's got to be something come out of it. But we got the first resolution through at the Governing Council to look at UNEP and how we could strengthen it in the lead up to Rio Plus 20, and had the meetings in Belgrade and Rome. Then on to Helsinki, and my dear friend Bradney took it through to Helsinki and to Rio, because I'd gone to CITES by then. But it was co-chaired by Italy and Kenya. And that's a great process, and that was a successful process. What came out of Rio Plus 20 in terms of universal membership, the UN Environmental Assembly, additional budget through the regular budget, these did serve to greatly strengthen UNEP. So I think Rio Plus 20 was a good event for UNEP.
Indeed, there was a lot of thinking that went on before Rio Plus 20, and having been on the outside, one of the people who analyze that institution and push for reform from the analytical perspective from academia. You know, I've been part of the debates on what should be done with UNEP institutionally, having entered the debate arguing for a global environment organization, then having studied quite a bit and figuring out, oh no, the original vision was the right vision, and maybe we don't need a specialized agency, but we need to empower UNEP in its form. There still has been, and especially at Rio Plus 20, not 2012, this push from member states and from several academics that we need to so-called upgrade UNEP to a specialized agency. We need to change the institutional form to a specialized agency. Now, John, you were in the organization, you knew those debates. I would like to hear the voice of an insider of what, in your opinion, John Scanlon's opinion, or the pros and cons for the institutional form that UNEP has, and the possibility of changing that institutional form. Where do you stand in that debate, and why?
Thanks, Maria. So I needed to be a bit more circumspect at the time, because you're managing a process, and we wanted to get all ideas onto the table. And within the UNEP Secretariat, there were differing views. Some were very much supportive of the idea of specialized agencies. Others were more for the reform of the existing institution, or if you like, the further strengthening of the existing institution without changing its form. My personal view is that the challenge for UNEP was not its form. I actually think they got it pretty well right in 1972. And I do think being a program of the General Assembly was the right way forward. I do think that UNEP was given a very powerful mandate, and I think that mandate was further reinforced and reiterated many times. Look at the Nairobi Declaration, look at what came out of Malmo, then you look at what came out of Rio, and Rio was quite a milestone, in particular with the UN Environmental Assembly outcome and the regular budget outcome. But I couldn't see how a specialized agency was going to tackle the fundamental challenges that we were dealing with. And that is, you know, UNEP is supposed to be the global environmental authority. It's supposed to be the one that sets the global environmental agenda. It has a coordinating function, etc. And it wasn't quite living up to that. I don't think the problem was form. I think that perhaps within the UN system itself, it wasn't respecting the UNEP mandate. It wasn't giving UNEP the space that it was mandated for in terms of exercising that role. So there are many reasons there. So I was not convinced. Maybe, well, even back in 1972, I think it was very hard to make a case for a specialized agency. I think some yearn for the ILO, UNESCO, WHO type model. I think that the horse had already bolted from the stable by 1972. If you look at what UNESCO, ILO, WHO, WMA were all doing, and there was good rationale for not trying to pull everything under a specialized agency. So I think the form was right. I think the mandate was right, and it's been strengthened in the right way. UNEP's been a bit of a roller coaster ride, highs and lows, but it has not yet, at its 50th anniversary, lived up to what its mandate is. It's not yet seen as the global environmental authority that sets a global environmental agenda, and it's not been able to coordinate the system as was anticipated. It's had many successes, but I think that big bit still hasn't come to pass. There's some reasons for that, but I don't think it was a form issue. I don't think the form would have changed. And a specialized agency, you negotiate it as a treaty, and then you have to get, you know, states to sign up and join the specialized agency. And who's to say that what you negotiate through a specialized agency is going to be any stronger? And you can't, through that specialized agency, change the mandates of existing conventions, et cetera, which is already there. And I actually thought a specialized agency is one step removed from the funds and programs of the UN. It would be actually possibly harder to coordinate. So for me, universal membership, the UNEA was fantastic. I think that gives you the platform for an authoritative voice, and getting more money from the regular budget was very important as well.
Thank you, John. You did indeed make in just a couple of minutes the argument that I do make in my book on UNEP, the Untold Story of the UN Environment Program.
Oh, you mean this book, Maria?
Oh, look at that. Yes, hold it up. Oh, but yes, indeed, because I did have the opportunity, the honor to talk with the founders of the system and those who envisioned the institution, those who made it happen and put it in place. And I know that we have among the participants today, Crystal MacDonald, the wife of the late Ambassador John MacDonald, whose vision it was to create the kind of institution we have, and who did write the foreword for this book just a few months before he passed. I also see that we have Donald Kanyaro of Kenya, who was in the Kenyan mission to the United Nations and arguing for Nairobi to be the location for the first headquarters of an international organization in the global south. So welcome Donald, welcome Crystal. It's fantastic to have you among us today. Feel free to put reactions in the chat, in the Q&A. We can spotlight you. But thank you for this input, John. But you mentioned the conventions and UNEP's relationship with the convention, and you've been on both sides. So what is your view on UNEP's role vis-a-vis the conventions. There are many of those, and yet some are administered by UNEP, others are not. What is the best role for UNEP in that landscape?
Right, so I'm a firm believer that I want the UN Environment Programme to be the global authority, to be the authoritative voice, to be the one that brings coherence to the system right across, right? Now, the reality is that even before UNEP was created, or just as it was being created as well, there are a number of conventions in existence. We have now multiple conventions. I don't buy into this 500 or 1,000 or what have you, because that includes bilateral agreements, includes river basin agreements, everything else. There's about 15, probably 15 or so major global conventions that we're really concerned about here. Some of them are administered by FAO, some are administered by UNESCO, some are administered by UNEP, IUCN, etc. And they're scattered all over the place. So, you know, if people had hoped that everything was under one umbrella, it's not there. And I think we should stop aspiring towards that. You know, we have a particular architecture that's there, but how do we tweak it to make it work as effectively as possible? I sat on the biodiversity liaison group of the CBD convenes for 8 years. Nobody cared who was administered by who. We didn't sit there and say, you know, World Heritage Convention, you're UNESCO, and Ramsar, you're IUCN, so somehow your views are different. We couldn't care less who was administering who. We're actually talking about the substance. What are we trying to do together? And in particular, you know, in the lead up to the CBD COP in Nagoya, a lot of discussion about how we can all converge and contribute towards the strategic plan on biodiversity and subsequent to that as well. So it was a substantive discussion. Now, the reality with UNEP, this administrative relationship, you cannot manipulate a convention through administrating its secretariat. And if you try, it's the most agitating thing for the parties that they can imagine. I don't see any value add for UNEP administering conventions, to be honest. What they do is they get stuck in this administrative, you know, tit for tat about whether or not the services are good, whether you're paying too much, too little, is there interference with this or that? I don't know why UNEP wants to be involved in that. I would say, you know, liberate yourself from administering conventions. It's not the main game. It's not going to change the face of the planet. It's not being a global authority for the environment. Let UN Office of Nairobi, UN Office of Geneva, UN Office of Vienna, or UN Secretary of New York, let them do the administration. And what you do as the global authority, you convene all the conventions. You convene climate, biodiversity, you know, CITES, Ramsar, bring them all together, and you are the convener, and you're going to look at programmatic coherence without being distracted by this administering some and not administering others. I really don't think it works for UNEP. I don't think it serves its interest. I want UNEP to lift itself out of the quagmire and lift itself above this. I would also like UNEP, and through UNEA, to review the effectiveness of conventions. It's a bit hard to review the effectiveness of conventions when you're sort of got tangled up with the administration of some and some not. Here, I'd say UNEP as the environmental authority, the UNEA, you look at what are we achieving through these conventions? Are they delivering? Are they not? Are they what we need? Et cetera, et cetera. And that to me is all attached also to a real authoritative state of the environment report. And this is one of the failings of UNEP, I think. We've never had something like an IPCC report or IPBES report that the world regards as the authoritative text on climate or biodiversity. UNEP's tried. I don't know why it hasn't succeeded. What we need is the equivalent through the UN Environmental Assembly, the State of the Planet report, issued every 2 years. What's the problem? How are we responding? Do we need to plug some gaps? Are we failing in implementation, or is it that the architecture is wrong? So if you like, a consolidation of some of the gap reports, but the world desperately needs that now. Who's telling the whole story of the state of the planet and reviewing what the UN system and the conventions are doing to lift us out of this? I think UNEP is the place to do that. So I'd say, don't bother with administering a couple of conventions. Not worth your trouble.
I agree wholeheartedly, and I'm one of the, indeed, one of the few people that make that argument and had made it in the book. Drop the conventions. UNEP does not need to administer them, and lift up. UNEP, in my view, is the only international organization that has the explicit mandate to see the 3,000 piece puzzle from 30,000 feet down or up. It needs to deliver. But you asked a very important, or you made a very strong point, John, that UNEP has not delivered the authoritative state of the planet report. And you say you don't know why that is the case. I'd like to push on that and ask our participants here, why? Why do you think that is the case? All of you, I see Scott Hayjost, who's been working with IUCN and with UNEP, and Mark Halley, and many people. Put in the chat, why do you think that is the case, or challenge John Scanlon's views?
Arthur dialed there as well. I put this question to him myself 2 days ago when we were in International Environment House together. The GEO, it is not, if you look at climate change and the authority of IPCC and its reports and how that science has been, leading the convention and the parties, and if you look, IPBS, I think, has done a remarkable job in an extraordinary short space of time to also get that level of credibility and authority. And it's really helping the Convention on Biological Diversity move ahead with its agenda. But when we look at the whole, as you said, there's only one organization in the UN, and I think only one organization in the world outside of the UN, that can really give us the complete picture on the state of the planet. And I saw the Secretary General made a very powerful, speech, I think, last year on the state of the planet. There should be a biannual state of the planet report from the UN Environmental Assembly, and it needs to follow the process is as important as the content in the UN, as you know. But that should actually be guiding the priorities of the GEF. That should be guiding the priorities of UNDP. That should be guiding the priorities of the UN system. It should be the one that is, if you like, the text that is letting us know where we are and where we need to go. Instead, the GEF does its own. UNDP does its own. Everybody seems to have their little piece of the environment, but where's that authoritative, assessment and that authoritative voice that is pulling all these strings together? And Arthur the other day talked to me about, the conductor of the orchestra. You don't have to own all the instruments, you don't have to own all the equipment, but you need to get the orchestra playing to one sheet, yeah? And that's where we have an opportunity for UNEP. And that's what I'd like to see UNEP, because the world needs that. That's what we need. But I can tell you more about what I'd do if I had a magic wand.
Oh, what would you do, John, if you had a magic wand?
No, well, in part, it's always when you're in a UN entity or any entity, resourcing is always a big issue. So you need to attract financing. It's quite competitive for financing within and outside of the UN. And I understand that. But for example, if I look at the Global Environment Facility, we have multiple executing and implementing agencies, including UNEP. I would say, why do you want UNEP scrapping around for projects through the GEF? I would like to see the Executive Director of UNEP as an ex officio member of the GEF board. I would like to see the GEF recognise UNEP and its State of the Planet report as the guiding light in terms of setting its priorities. And I would like UNEP to review the effectiveness of GEF in achieving what it's expected to achieve. But instead that's all sort of captured within GEF itself. So, and UNEP is just one of multiple agencies bidding for projects. I don't know that we desperately need more and more agencies bidding for projects. We do need what you call that anchor institution or that apex institution. We need, or that conductor of the orchestra, we need that entity that is sitting over the top with authority. And I'd like to see the Executive Director of UNEP as an ex officio member of the Executive Board of UNDP. I would like to see UNEP and UNDP wedded at the hip in terms of UNEP's asked to deliver capacity building, quite rightly. Doesn't mean you all have to be UNEP staff or have UNEP officers. You can deliver capacity by engaging with partners. that relationship between UNEP and UNDP needs to be much closer, and UNDP as a delivery arm. It's stepping into the environment space big time if you look at its current strategy to 2025. But I don't know where UNEP was in that discussion. Maybe they were. I mean, I haven't been privy to it, but you know, and maybe we need the General Assembly to say, okay, these are two of our programs. We want you to come together and do things differently.
And John, you know, in the very beginning, the vision was of Maurice Strong's, the first UNEP executive director. His vision was that UNEP and UNDP will work much more closely together, that they will have units that would exchange staff, and that UNEP will inform the development agenda of the United Nations system. So that was the original vision. The question again is why? Why did these things happen? And this is indeed the academics in us. We are the conveners of these dialogues. We have a number of our doctoral and master's students here in this dialogue, and you are posing research questions that we can take up. And indeed, you mentioned Bradney Chambers in the beginning, the late Bradney Chambers. And Bradney did come to us several years ago in 2013, 2014, asking us to assess the effectiveness of the conventions, of the environmental conventions. And it set us on a research agenda that led to the creation of the Environmental Conventions Index that assesses the level of implementation. And just this morning, we finished a session with the Middle East and North African countries, which is part of a 2-week course on this. And I see several of the participants in that course are here. They're government representatives. So I just want to make a note that the GEF means Global Environment Facility, because we do have people from various walks of life here. Not everyone knows all of the acronyms that we use. But on your point of a conductor, Julia Martin-Lefebvre, who was previously also the Director General of IUCN and a very close collaborator of ours, said that UNEP should be in a quest for symphony. And we did produce one of our first movies about global environmental governance that is called Quest for Symphony. The second one was the Quest for Leadership. And Jadine can put those links to the films in the chat. But this is exactly how we've been thinking about the system. But coming back to your magic wand, we have a question from Solomon Kialo from Kenya, who is working on CITES. And he asks you, if you came back to CITES as Secretary General, what things would you prioritize to do that bring greater synergies among the biodiversity conventions?
Thanks for that. And let's talk about what has been done. Certainly when I joined CITES, I found I think it's a fantastic convention, excellent legal instrument, but it was rather inward looking, and it didn't really want to get caught up in the biodiversity convention or, you know, a lot of the sustainable development debates, etc. Want to sort of stick to its lane and not get distracted. And working with the CITES parties and with the Secretariat, I think we shifted that around relatively quickly, because through the strategic plan of CITES and through decisions taken by the parties, they agreed that we would look at how we are contributing towards the strategic plan on biodiversity. So we, if you like, you know, conventions are cautious to do this, but we saw ourselves as a contributor to the strategic plan on biodiversity. So you keep doing what you're doing, which is important, but you look at the contribution you're making in a much broader sense. So that for the first time ever, we looked at ourselves in the context of contributing towards the strategic plan on biodiversity. That was extremely important. Every party agreed, one party abstained. That party is not a party to the Convention on Biological Diversity, but they didn't try and block things. The other thing is, in the lead up to Rio, we were also interested in the Sustainable Development Agenda. How do you link CITES to the Sustainable Development Agenda? We actually had a paragraph in the Future We Want, paragraph 287 from recollection, specifically dedicated to CITES. Excuse me, looking at the CITES sitting at the intersection between trade, environment, and development. So we got ourselves into the Sustainable Development Agenda to show the contribution you make through well-regulated trade towards achieving that sustainable. So there was a lot done, and we very actively engaged in the biodiversity liaison group. Braulio Diaz was great. He was the then executive secretary of CBD, trying to bring us all together. And we had a good sort of sense of family amongst the biodiversity conventions about how we're all contributing towards that. So I think good progress has been made there. Again, I'd say carry that through. We have the post-2020 strategic plan on biodiversity. Again, and I'm sure the Secretariat and the parties are seeking to align with that. So that's a continuation of what we did with the previous plan into the new plan, and continuing to demonstrate a contribution towards the sustainable development agenda. So I think progress has been made there. Sometimes people think contributing towards a bigger piece means you lose your specific piece. That's not the case. You know, you have to, with CITES, execute that convention effectively. You have to regulate trade, or play your role in regulating the trade well, do that properly, but demonstrate how that is linked to, you know, saving biodiversity, links to livelihoods, links to security, links to sustainable development. So it's doing your job well, but showing that it's contributing to a wider whole. If it's not contributing to a wider agenda, then you have to rethink whether you're doing the right thing or not.
This brings me, John, to a question we have from Elena Paronian, who is a master's student in our program, and she's asking about the connections between the international and the global and the local. So these various levels of governance that you are talking about, how do they contribute to each other? But also, how do we make everyone everywhere to be involved in political action? But let me also tack in another question, because we did receive something from Stanley Johnson in advance. And Stanley is someone who has been working on these issues, has written a number of books about wildlife, where what was it? Where, I forgot, where the, not the animals, where the great things were. But Stanley is also the father of the Prime Minister of the UK, of Boris Johnson. And Stanley asked about the pressure to ban travel agents from selling tours to sites where African or Asian elephants are abused, and the move to ban the import of hunting trophies. So this connects to your local to global interaction. And how do we tackle this?
Thanks. And we have international agreements because we recognize there are, cross-border issues. We will need a collective effort. So if an issue is purely domestic, it can be dealt with domestically. But when you look at biodiversity loss, climate change, international trade in species, migratory species, etc., there is a dimension that goes beyond the domestic. You have to cooperate with one another if you're going to be able to achieve your end goal. What we do need to do is connect what happens at this international space, which perhaps historically hasn't happened as often as we'd like, with what happens at national and at local level. I think we are starting to see more of that, certainly with climate change, with the nationally determined contributions and the relevance of them at a domestic and local level. I think we're seeing that. The Convention on Biological Diversity is trying to do the same through their National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plans. Don't think they've been quite as successful, but there's still that attempt to take the global agreement into a domestic level. I think CITES work quite effectively because with CITES, you have national scientific and management authorities in every country that are designated to deal with that convention, but also it's a very hands-on convention. It regulates, so you have the real plants and animals and parts thereof in trade that need permits or need to be addressed in terms of attempts to traffic them, etc. So it is an issue, but I think there are attempts underway to translate this down. And I think there's much more sort of transparency now. We're seeing more reports. A lot of the reports on climate, these gap reports and assessing what's being said against what needs to be done. We need to see the same in biodiversity, because this reporting really makes it very transparent. And governments then have to show, well, what are they doing? There's a big gap here in what they've said here and what's happening on the ground. So with what Stanley's raised, and greetings Stanley, he's been a champion of wildlife for many years. He's touched on some of the more contentious issues you can think of, issues to do with hunting and issues to do with animal welfare, etc. Speaking generally, the international community has decided not to address animal welfare, animal rights issues through international instruments. CITES deals with it a bit in terms of the welfare of a live animal in trade. But the sort of issues that Stanley's raised in terms of looking at it from that perspective have not yet come into the international space. There is a lot of research, there's a lot of academic work and a lot of NGOs involved in this space, so that could well change. But at this stage, the animal rights and animal welfare agenda has not yet found its way in a substantive way into international instruments. It's more been left to domestic choice and voluntary initiatives.
Thank you, John. I see several questions have come in that I'd like to integrate into this discussion. So Jody Williams asks, do you have an opinion on the rights of nature movement, which connects to exactly what you're talking about? Is that a strong, powerful theme to assert the primacy of the environment? And connected to that, from Narges Safar, who is one of the participants in this course for implementation of the conventions that we're delivering right now that I spoke about, she asks about your opinion on the Global Pact for the Environment.
So I think one thing that has been positive in terms of coming out of this COVID-19 pandemic is that I think it's been perhaps the straw that broke the camel's back in terms of realizing we've got to recalibrate our relationship with nature. You know, we cannot keep treating nature, we cannot keep interacting with wildlife the way we have. It's bad for biodiversity, bad for climate, puts us at risk of future pandemics, it's bad for animal health, it's bad for security, it's bad for development. So I think there's a recognition of that. But how do you recalibrate? What does that equal in real life? I'll give you one brief example. I was a commissioner on the Murray-Darling Basin Commission in Australia. We had overexploited the water resource. We needed to put more water back into the river, which means you need to buy it back from the farmers and put it in for an environment use. What we had to do is we created an environmental water right. So the environment actually had a license, and the environment, through the Environment Minister, owned that water and kept that water to keep the system healthy. If the environment didn't need it in a year, it could sell it to agriculture for exploitative use. But we had to designate water specifically for the purpose of the environment, to protect the environment. Now, I think there's quite a bit of traction here in terms of rights. We're looking at the human rights agenda is much more prevalent in terms of the environment dimension of sustainable development. We saw Human Rights Council in terms of, you know, recognizing human right to the environment, clean, healthy environment and sustainability, etc. So we're seeing a big shift there. The right to nature, some countries have looked at that. I would say we should put everything on the table, because we really do need to see what's going to be the best way, either internationally or at a domestic level, to recalibrate what we're doing, because we're on the road to nowhere if we don't make some fundamental shifts. In terms of the Global Pact, the Global Pact's been around for a while. I remember being in Nairobi in Gigiri when it was being discussed. It offers some potential.
John, maybe frame it a little bit so that people understand what it is, because it still is part of our jargon language. What is the Global Pact for the Environment?
Well, I was with colleagues in Marseille at the IUCN Congress, and they were talking of it, but it's intended to be a bit of an umbrella pact that can sit over the top and assist in providing, I think, some coherence and some direction. I would say it offers some promise. There are a number of other initiatives underway as well at the moment in terms of law reform. We've got the Global Pandemics Treaty, which hopefully will embed a One Health approach. We've got a lot of discussions around ecocide, both internationally and domestically. We've got discussions about a wildlife crime agreement. We've got the Global Pact. I think we've got a lot of good initiatives underway that are forcing us and forcing states to rethink the existing system. We can't let the status quo prevail. And so we need to shake it up. And all of these initiatives, I think, are helping us do that, look at things differently.
You mentioned these new initiatives and crime, and I know you have been working quite a bit on reframing the dialogue and focusing on transnational crime. This is an area where we do not have a convention. We do not really have the legal framework. The CITES convention is one on trade, but not really on illegal trade, right? So can you talk a little bit about the transnational crime, the work that you have been doing on that, and the space for thinking and for research in that area?
Thanks, Maria. Yeah, so when I was at CITES, I became aware of the scale and nature of wildlife trafficking, in particular affecting elephant and rhino. And the political attention, the public recognition was just not there. So we embarked on a course of engaging politically, but also publicly, but also with the agencies that deal with transnational organized crime, Interpol, UN Office of Drugs and Crime, World Customs Organization. Because if we didn't have them on board, we were not going to get anywhere. CITES was a trade-related instrument, is a trade-related instrument. It has science and management authorities designated under the convention. It's not designed for, nor is it capable of combating transnational organized crime. But we could be a catalyst for that. And we were a catalyst for that. And we brought together a consortium to combat wildlife crime with those organizations, plus the World Bank. And we made great progress. But there's a couple of limitations there. CITES is a trade instrument. It's not a crime instrument. It has science and management authorities. It doesn't oblige you to criminalize conduct. It obliges you to penalize. It only covers CITES listed species. That's 38,000 species out of the world's 8 million species. There are millions of animals and plants found in illicit trade that are not regulated by CITES. And at the moment, in almost every country on the planet, they pay no attention to that. So if it's CITES listed, customs will take a look at it. If it's not CITES listed, it doesn't matter whether you stole it from the source country, how much you stole from the source country, it's through home. You know, it's not regulated under international law. We need to fundamentally change this. The World Bank says that wildlife trafficking is having an impact worth 1 to 2 trillion a year on, as a result of its impact on ecosystems, how it degrades ecosystems, their ability to mitigate climate change, etc. And that's not even adding the risk of pandemics from illicit trafficking in certain wild animals. So we've never had a crime that affects the environment recognized through the international criminal law framework. And we believe that illicit trafficking in wildlife, given its scale, nature, and consequences in terms of impact on species, biodiversity, climate, public and animal health, livelihoods, loss of government revenue, it needs to be captured within that framework as a protocol under the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime. So we think we need to step it up. This is another example of where, you know, the system needs upgrading, and we can do it. We don't have to invent something totally new. It's a protocol under an existing convention, but it's embedding it in the criminal law system, dealing with the traffickers to take pressure off source countries and to respect the laws of source countries.
And you make us think, John, on this point, then how do we engage the environmental governance system with the criminal governance system? And when you have a protocol within an existing convention that is managed by a totally different part of the global governance system, how do we engage the global environmental governance institutions and UNEP indeed, and the conventions in that? It's a really good question. But we are coming toward the end of our very lively, very vibrant discussion today. I'd like to ask a question that Uno Svedin from the Stockholm Resilience Center in Stockholm University put in the chat. And he's asking you to reflect a little bit about the local, regional, global connections. And we often see them as a hierarchical or nested within each other, but are there any other ways to interplay governance complexities? And we have only three minutes. And on that note, also, I would like to ask a question that Andreas Kremer had sent in advance, saying, what are your hopes and concerns looking for the next 50 years?
So thanks for that. I think one of the things we did in the biodiversity liaison group is we didn't work out who was the most important convention. We just had an agreement. They're all equally important. They just have different mandates. And I think it's the same regional, global, local, etc. They're all equally important. You know, you need an international framework, you need regional. It has to be local, because if it doesn't happen locally, then it doesn't happen. So that is you know, essential. But it's not that one's more important than the other. They are all equally important. They just have a different lens, if you like, a different constituency. But let's not always try and rank everything, you know, from more important, less important. I would say international, local are equally important. They just have different intersections. With the biodiversity liaison group, my perspective was we're all equal. I don't care if you're with IUCN or UNESCO, if you've got 180 parties, 150 parties, we're all important. We just have different mandates. And once you respect each other in that way, you can make huge progress. In terms of in the next 50 years, in 2072, the 100th anniversary of UNEP, I would say that the UN General Assembly between now and then is going to change the name of UN Environment Programme to the World Environment Organization. A name change to reflect the fact that this is the global organization that is there as the authoritative voice. Don't need to change the form, change the name, just send a signal. General Assembly can call it whatever it wants. It has the State of the Environment Report, State of the Planet Report, and that State of the Planet Report is the report that's guiding everyone in what they're doing. It's not administering MEAs, but it is looking at MEAs and it is calling them out for good behavior or bad behavior, success or failure. And then MEAs will be a little bit cautious about the UN Environment Assembly, about what it's going to say about what it's delivering. And then what we're going to see in Gigiri, we're going to see in Gigiri by 2072, a huge hologram of planet Earth in real time, showing you the state of the planet based upon the State of the Planet report that has come out that year from the World Environment Organization there in Gigiri in UNEP. So I would love to see UNEP be that global authoritative voice. I think it can be, I think it will be. We just have to push hard for it and don't get caught up in all the little bits and pieces. Aim high, go hard.
Thank you, John, for that vision. And I know we're finishing up, but UNEP did try to change its name to UN Environment. Why didn't that stick?
Well, the thing is that it's actually states parties that would decide what the name of an organization is, not an executive director. So within the UN, it's a question, process is equally as important as content. If you get the process wrong, forget about the content. And here, the UN General Assembly can do whatever it likes. It can call it whatever it's like. And what I'm saying here is that if we wanted to send a signal in the next 50 years, you could do that. I'm not fussed, but never, ever tinker with either mandate or name without due process and respecting the sovereign right of states to make the call.
And this is exactly the point of everyone everywhere, knowing about the organization. This has been our mission of bringing these dialogues to the world, UNEP celebrating UNEP at 50. And we actually do think that everybody should know that acronym. UNEP is the UN Environment Program until it changes to, I would say, GEO, Global Environment Organization, rather than WEO. But until then, we can make the case that it needs to change the name. But I agree with you, John. The original vision was right. The original mandate is ambitious. It needs to be fulfilled. The organization needs to be enabled. But for that, it has to be visible. And this is what we tried to do here, make it more visible, more relatable with the people who were at UNEP, like John, or in parts of the global environmental governance system, and now with a non-governmental entity. But all of us as professionals will come in and out of various institutions, of various organizations. But I hope that we all remain as committed as John Scanlon to this agenda. I thank you, John, for being here with us today and wrapping up the dialogue series for calendar year 2021. We will resume in January when we come back from winter break. We have the entire January off, but we will, in this part of the world, we will resume with a new with a new dialogue. We have not finalized the interlocutors then. We're in a dynamic process, but with this, you can join our listserv, join the discussion, and tell us your untold story of UNEP. Here you have the book that I have just published, the 50th anniversary of UNEP, but we already have requests from member states to have a book on UNEP at 75. I hope to be around then, but certainly will not be around at UNEP at 100. So whoever you are who are thinking about a longer career, we can start working on that. So with that, John, thank you very much for joining us. Everyone in this room, thank you for being with us, and we invite you to continue to engage and continue the dialogues. Have a wonderful rest of the day and the week.
Thanks,
Goodbye.
Maria, and thanks to everyone online and for all the questions. Great work, Maria. Keep it going.
Thank you, John.
Thanks. Cheers.